hope everybody's having a great conference. I am. This has been super fun so far. So thanks for the introduction, Normal. I've been really looking forward to spending this time with you guys. Like Normal said, I'm the director of DevOps at IHS Markit. When I was hired, the company was called Ipreo, but we got bought over the summer, so that's been super fun. We're now a gigantic publicly owned company with 16,000 employees. The products that I work on are in the financial services space, so I help rich people get even richer than they are right now. We sell software to big banks like Bank of America and Wells Fargo, and they use our platforms to take companies public. So for those of you who work in startups that got super rich, you're welcome. Companies like Snapchat, Facebook, Alibaba have all gone public on our platform. About 70% of IPOs happen on our products. We also sell software to municipalities, so 98% of domestic bond raising happens on our platform. So if you want to talk about like cornering a market, my God, that's amazing, right? So basically any hospital or school or road or bridge that's publicly funded, those municipalities use our programs to do that. That's kind of cool. We also sell software to private companies to help people keep track of equities, disbursements, and things like that. So if you ever have stock options issued to you as part of your employment, then you might be using our platform to do that, which is kind of fun. Pain avoidance. Pain avoidance is like one of the most fundamental motivators that all living things have, right? There's even research that shows that trees avoid pain. And yet, sometimes we voluntarily do things that are extremely painful. So yesterday somebody asked about long distance running. I don't do full marathons because I'm not totally insane, but I do half marathons. The only reason I run is because I have this really weird heart disease, and if I don't run, I'll die. Otherwise, I would not run. I would play more video games and I would sleep more. But some people run because they like it. Why do we sometimes choose to do painful things? I think most of the time it's because we know that the reward is going to be worth it. We know that the payoff is going to be worth that short-term pain, right? So during the next half hour or so, we're going to be talking about why we might voluntarily submit ourselves to pain. Like Normal said, I studied to be a history teacher, but I thought dealing with apathetic parents and children was too easy, so I got into IT instead. We're going to talk about large-scale organizational change. It's not easy to do, but there is a really big payoff. And I'm just hoping to share with you guys what my story's been like over the last 3 years as we've driven that change at Ipreo. Everybody gets to define DevOps. I'm not going to miss my chance to do that. We've talked a lot about culture. This is my wording of the same thing you've heard 15 times already, so we're not going to go into it in a lot of depth. Success at Ipreo looks like this. This is actual data. When I joined the company 3 years ago, we had a centralized release management team that processed a little over 900 manual requests for change per month. Those 900 requests per month added up to over 350 days of delay. What could your organization do with 350 person days of recovered time? That's a big payoff, right? Those 900 requests would drive maybe, at best, in a given month, about 100 deployments for 30 customer-facing products across all environments. So not a lot of velocity, right? We're not making a lot of headway. And there's a lot of work that's going into do very little payoff. Okay, so over the last 3 years, through a lot of work, we've driven that down to essentially no delays. And the numbers that trail off there, those tickets are still getting created in the same system, but they're for audit and tracking purposes. So there's very little manual work that gets done today. That doesn't happen by doing iterative things. Okay, so the answer for Ipreo wasn't a small change where I just go into the release management team and we give them a new set of tools. That's not going to get it done. That wasn't going to drive what the business leaders were asking me to do. We wanted a big transformation, and that means you have to change the model. So in Ipreo, the enterprise DevOps model looks like this, where we've sprinkled the DevOps magic on all the application teams, and they then become masters of their own fate. They engage with a set of tools through an internal tools team. I took a release management team, I transformed them into internal tools, we updated the tool stack, we trained the heck out of the teams, boom, we're done. Other kind of key things to point out, and I think it's worth sort of calling out a few other actual data points here, which is that for us, that automation that I talked about doesn't translate into one-to-one activity. it was interesting to me to see how quickly release activity increased as we automated tasks. It was about 10x, in other words. So we do over 9,000 deployments per month now across all those products and environments. In fact, in January this year, we did over 20,000. And I'm not really honestly sure why. We had to go back and try and figure it out, what drove all that. But no one noticed, right? It was just like lots of speed and innovation, and it just was enabled. It's pretty cool. We see pretty clearly that there's a correlation with automation and DevOps and quality. So defects are down 24%. And if we look at net promoter scores of our products and customers, it's pretty clear that the teams and areas that have adopted DevOps the most have the biggest increases in net promoter score. Why do we care about net promoter score? Because it should lead to good business outcomes, right? It should lead to higher revenue, better sales, less churn. But this stuff doesn't happen automatically. It's not actually magic. You don't just sprinkle DevOps magic on teams. There's 3 big areas I want to talk about over the rest of my time that have been a serious pain for me. Some of these things we got through, and some of them I really wish I had done differently and done better. We're going to talk about executives, culture or behaviors, and we're going to talk about team health. Okay? So first of all, executives do not get it. They do not understand what DevOps is. And that's okay, right? That's to be expected. The bigger your organization, the longer the distance is between business leaders and the individual contributors on your teams. And that distance creates lots of opportunity for misunderstanding. When I joined the company 3 years ago, I'd ask the executives, what do you think I'm going to be doing here? And the response was, oh, well, we hired you to improve how we release our products. I was like, well, that's true. That is true. But they had no idea what that actually meant or what was going to go into that or what that journey looked like. And so I had to spend quite a bit of time working with these executives to educate them. My wife really appreciated all the business travel to New York, where our executives all live. I was up there like twice a month for 6 months. It was not super cool. But I did rack up a lot of Delta miles. Free upgrades are a real thing. It was important to do that, though. Some of my colleagues disagreed with this, though. I've met with other colleagues, and they're like, no, Lee, you're wasting your time. You just offset 6 months of work. You should have just gone straight to the dev teams, let the executives believe whatever they want to believe. But I think that's a huge mistake, and I've seen that go terribly wrong. Here's what happens. You start working with the teams, the executives think Lee's here to just improve the release process, and what happens? The team releases something and it breaks, right? They do a release, it doesn't work, it gets escalated up to the executives, and they say, what the heck happened? And the person who doesn't want to get blamed for this problem says, oh, it's Lee's fault. He changed things so that the release management team doesn't do the release anymore. Now the team does it, and they broke it. And then what happens? The executive has a reaction, and he issues a thou shalt. Thou shalt not release code until it bakes for 24 hours. Thank you, Nathan, for the story yesterday. That's where proclamations like that come from. It comes from a misunderstanding between the business leadership level and what the team is trying to do. Right? You want to avoid those types of situations wherever possible. Other proclamations I've seen are, the release management team is the only team that can release to production until you figure all this stuff out. The issue is, if you fall into that trap, you will lose credibility with your organization really quickly, and your ability to drive change is going to be severely hampered. People aren't going to trust you anymore, right? Because they're going to see how fast you have put yourself in a bad situation, how quickly the executives can come in and cut your legs out from under you. So the way to avoid that is to make sure you bring the executives along for the ride. They need to understand what you're doing and how you're doing it and why. And there's kind of 2 big areas that I think you can focus on to be successful here. Number 1 is don't ignore constraints. Challenge them, yes. Think about them. Try and bust out of the box or change the way you're meeting those constraints, but don't ignore them. Most of your business leaders have backgrounds in legal, they've worked on customer contracts, they understand regulatory constraints. If they raise a concern to you like, I don't know, I think our contracts might have clauses in them that make it hard to do what you're talking about because of production access and separation of responsibility, your response can't be, well, it's fine, we'll figure it out. Right? If you do that, they're not going to trust you. The executives are not going to trust you. Right? What you really want to do is you want to respond and say, oh, that's okay, I'm working with the head of contracts. We are auditing our contracts right now. We're going to make sure we've got that stuff settled down and that we understand what our contracts actually say. Furthermore, I'm also going to work with our head of customer support and customer success I'm going to make sure our customers understand what we're doing and how it's going to benefit them. So our relationship with our customers is protected as well. And there's a lot more to relationships than contracts. Contracts are really just the kind of a final thing, right? It's what you fall back on when the relationship fails. So prove to the executives that you're thinking about these things. So we talk about DevSecOps, and I just wonder if we need like DevSecReg legal ops, right? Because we're moving everything left now, right? The other thing that I want you to do and think about, we talk a lot about metrics, we're going to talk more about metrics in a couple minutes, is metrics are a great opportunity to build a bridge with your executives between what you're going to be measuring at the team level and what drives business success and business outcomes that the executives care about. Spend time understanding what the executives care about. What are the things that are driving what they think is business success? What are they measuring? You might be surprised. Sometimes you think, oh, it's top line revenue growth, but actually sometimes it's EBITDA. Sometimes they care a lot about overhead. And so you coming in and saying, I'm going to introduce all this extra cost, is not going to go over well unless they understand what the payoff of that stuff is. So you need to understand what the executives are looking for and then build a bridge conceptually between these things that are easy to measure, that your teams can measure, and what the business executives are measuring and caring about. Right? Those things, typically, what business executives are measuring are trailing indicators of these metrics. In other words, you will see improvements and changes to these kinds of metrics before you will see changes and improvements to what those executives are looking at. That's okay, but make sure they understand the relationship between those two things, and you need to understand it as well. Okay, so let's talk about culture and behaviors. I'm really, really excited that the DevOps movement is focusing more on culture. I mean, it's like, I felt bad about this whole section of my slide deck because you guys have heard about this a lot already. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how to change people's behavior, right? Because to me, culture is sort of values and behavior. Most rational people behave in a way that is congruent and flows from their value structure. The challenge that we have when we're driving DevOps transformations is that most organizations don't have explicit engineering values. Most of the time, those values have been arrived at sort of like backing into them. Right? There are business realities and constraints in the organization that have caused people's behaviors to be a certain way, and that has built up a set of values that's now ingrained in the organization. And in order to change people's behaviors, you've got to figure out what those values were. So another big job I had at Ipreo was forensically determining what our values were, okay? And then using that as a way to move us forward. Now, if I just went in and I focused on action, 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 and I didn't think about motivation, those things can tend to fall flat. I can't be in every room. We have 65 Scrum teams, right? I can't be in every room when all those teams are making all their decisions. I can't even build a staff that can be in all those rooms. I have to help those people understand how their values need to change so that the net effect that we have in the organization is big and big enough, okay? Now, one of the ways I like to do this is I like to put values in contention with one another. So I'm going to tell you another story. When I joined Ipreo, I started doing some research into our infrastructure and our products, and I found a lot of tight coupling. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never worked in an engineering organization where we're like, yes, tight coupling is a core value. We want to make sure we tight couple everything, right? No one has that as a core value, yet we see it all the time. Why? Because at some point, and when I dug into the history of the company and our products, I learned that there were times in our history where we were really cash strapped. Okay? We didn't have money. Sometimes we have this perception that big companies are just infinitely resourceful and there's just no limit to cash. That is not true. They have a checkbook just like you do, and they have to monitor their cash flow, and if they don't, people don't get paid. And that's a big problem. So there were times in our company history where, gosh, we really need to get this product out in production so we can close these contracts and we can get this money and we can grow to the next stage of our progress, right? And so a team gets the product ready, we're ready to go to production. All right, engineering, I need 5 servers, I need a new SQL Server cluster, I need these back-end servers, go set all this stuff up. And engineering says, I ain't got money. I can't go buy that hardware. So what are we going to do? We're going to find capacity somewhere else in our engineering space, right, in our data center, and I'm going to shoehorn you into these existing IIS servers. I'm going to put you on this existing SQL Server cluster. We're going to reuse this other queuing system over here, And so engineering engineers your solution into the data center. They don't buy any new servers. Product goes live, we close the business, hurrah, we go on to the next level of the company. And we never go back and fix that problem, right? Those decisions got made for really good reasons, with real constraints. But if you play that movie forward 5 years, you end up with a really nasty situation in your data centers. And that's one of the things that I walked into at Ipreo. And so what I had to do was sit down with our head of engineering, who had been given bonuses and rewards for 15 years for saving money on CapEx, and say, listen, great job, high five. You have grown the company to this point, amazing work. I don't know if I honestly know anyone who could have done it better than you. But we've reached a scaling point now in our organization where we can't go any further like this. And we have to change our values. So while we used to value saving money over engineering efficiency, we can no longer do that. We have to change our values in order to reach the business objectives that the company says that they want to hit. And so you got to change your thinking, right? You have to change your behaviors. Instead of, and when you have two options on how to do something, if one option sacrifices engineering efficiency and one option gives us efficiency by spending a little bit of money, we're going to use the one that gives us more engineering efficiency. Okay? If there's a third option that does both, great. But if we have two options that are in contention, we're going to let these values drive our behaviors, and this is going to lead to good outcomes for us. Right? By the way, not everyone is going to come along for the ride when you're changing values. That head of engineering, no longer with the company. That's okay, right? Those things are going to happen in order for the company to continue to grow. Don't be afraid of confronting those things really head on. Okay? Other good values to kind of put in contention with one another, for those of you who are developers, you know there's a big trade-off typically between perceived speed and quality, right? So this is another good set of values. Sometimes it's really important to hit a date in order to close business, in order to keep the business alive. I get that, right? But we have to recognize that in order to grow the company to a certain point, you might have to change that value structure. Same thing with team autonomy and centralized processes. Big organizations love centralized processes, right? Because they're easy to audit, they're easy to control, but there's a trade-off to be had there, and sometimes you need to challenge that. There are constraints to these things, okay? It's not a free-for-all. Again, there's hard limits on how much money we have. There's also hard limits on things like contracts, like I mentioned, or regulations that you need to be aware of. If you're operating internationally, and most big companies are, you need to understand what the regulatory landscape looks like. Hello, GDPR. This is another area where we need to talk about metrics too. So when we're talking about values, metrics are really important. It's a great opportunity for you to prove to your organization that you mean what you say. Okay? If you measure the wrong thing, you run the risk of being dissonant in your message. In other words, if you say, I really care about quality, but you measure how many hours a developer spends on a specific task, and you have processes in place that penalize that person, and by the way, a phone call can be a penalty for a developer. If you penalize that person if their actual hours spent is too much different than the estimated hours, are you sending the message that you care about quality if that's what you spend your time measuring? No, you're not. Again, you will lose credibility in your organization if there's dissonance in what you measure and what you say you value. So spend time being thoughtful about the metrics that you're using to measure how well this transformation is going and how healthy your company is, and make sure that that's in line with the values you say you support. Okay? I hate time tracking, by the way. Hate it. The worst. I gave a talk at this company called Blackstone, and I started a revolution in their engineering organization because I was like, tracking hours sucks. And their CTO was like, well, we do that. Don't do that. Keeping teams healthy. Okay, so this is another topic that's like really near and dear to me. So this is also something that I grossly undervalued and didn't think about when I started this transformation. Part of the reason that I did that, by the way, for those of you who are transformational leaders, and Jane, you're right, I'm glad you pointed that out, we are all transformational leaders, is I think leaders like myself, if you're like me, okay, I'm a huge egotistical, I can be an asshole sometimes. I'm a huge egotist, right? And so sometimes I make the mistake of assuming that everybody is like me. And I think a lot of mistakes we make as leaders flow from that. So you have to be self-aware about that, and you need to be kind of thinking about it. So for me, I just kind of assume, hey, everybody's a super genius, they're all super good looking, just like I am, and they're just going to go out and they're going to be developers and they're going to pick up operations, and why wouldn't they want to be on call for this legacy application that they didn't write? That's stupid. Why wouldn't they be able to do this stuff? Why wouldn't they be super excited to just magically be great DevOps engineers? So this is an area that I've spent a lot of time on over the last year thinking about and working on. Here's the reality of the situation, and Jane kind of talked about this some too. I'm going to walk through sort of an example. This is an example of a DevOps maturity model. I like maturity models. I recommend you do not take any ones off the shelf. Make sure you're using a maturity model that works for your business. It needs to be achievable and realistic. So let's walk through this, okay? Level 1 in the turquoise here. We're saying that in order to be a level 1 DevOps team, you have a build process that runs automatically when code is checked in. So now we have somebody on the application development team who's looking at the build process. Let's say they're using Jenkins, and they're tying it in with a webhook to your code repository system. Let's say you're using GitHub Enterprise. Okay? Somebody on your team has to set that up. They have to maintain the build process. They have to maintain that hook. Who's going to do that? Let's say his name is Bob. Okay, so we've got this guy named Bob. He's been a developer for a really long time. He's like, yeah, okay, nobody else knows how to do this. I'll just do it. Fine. It's not that hard. It's just Jenkins. Not a big deal. Lots of documentation. Great. Good job, Bob. Now, to get to level 2, we're saying that the output from that build process needs to get versioned. So now we're sticking it into Nexus or Artifactory. So now Bob is learning about Artifactory, right? Unless you're going to get somebody else to do it. So who realistically is going to make that change? It's probably going to be Bob, right? So now Bob is integrating with Artifactory. Going to level 3, Bob is now taking his Jenkins pipeline and he's extending it, and he's actually installing software, which is a different kind of automation than the build process. So now Bob's learning about infrastructure, he's learning about servers, he's installing software somewhere, he's thinking about configuration files and secrets, right? Maybe he's trying to set up a secrets manager, he's thinking about passwords, he's thinking about all the different parts of the system and how they can be dynamically assigned IP addresses and all that stuff. So Bob's starting to think about a lot more than just the build process. And then we go to level 4 and we're saying, you gotta have immutable infrastructure. Wow, okay. Now Bob is really getting his mind blown, right? Because now he's thinking about images, he's thinking about Puppet or Chef, he's thinking about Ansible or SaltStack, he's got some kind of configuration thing he's learning. Unless somebody else is gonna do that work, but realistically, who is gonna be doing that work? Probably the same person who's done all the work up till now, right? Unless you're carefully managing it, and nobody does that. Level 5, now we're saying there's zero downtime. So now Bob's learning about deployment strategies like blue-green or canary. He's looking at automation in terms of monitoring, automated rollbacks, right? Then what happens? Bob doubles his salary and takes a principal DevOps engineer job somewhere else, right? And by the way, congrats to all of you with DevOps in your job title on riding the gravy train, because that is smart business. The reality is that a DevOps transformation, again, I'm kind of copying what Jane was talking about, is we're changing the DNA of a team. We're fundamentally evolving what the team needs to be good at and what they need to be skilled at in order to be successful. We're expanding the scope that we expect application teams to be able to do. You know, they used to write a lot of great code, they cared about test automation and stuff like that, but we're adding in all of this other stuff. And, you know, again, and my big mistake was assuming that there were people on these teams that cared about operations and, you know, was okay with being on call for tier 2 support. That is not true. You have to really look hard at your teams and make sure that you're monitoring and measuring the health of these teams. I've done a lot of research on this, by the way. So what I'm finding is that it is a widespread problem in technology teams that we are not skilling our teams appropriately. I'm finding 9 out of 10 people are either on a team or have been on a team with what I call key person dependencies, Bobs or Brents from the Phoenix Project, right? That's a huge problem. The effects of people like that on a team are that they can't estimate work reliably. How many times have you been in a planning meeting where somebody says, oh, we can't really estimate that work because, you know, Jane's out of town, or, you know, Or you're trying to work on your sprint, you can't really get that task done because so-and-so is sick. Or this person on this other team, we need a dependency on this other team, crossing dependency. They can't get the work done because they have a person that's out. Think about how many times you've run into that situation. It happens all the time, right? The good news is that, and if you're irreplaceable, you're unpromotable. That's my tagline. You guys can tweet that. So high performers on your teams want to learn. That's the great news. So the bad news is you probably have skill distribution issues on your team. The good news is the solution is training, and the people on your teams that you want to keep want to learn, right? So there's a lot of documentation, evidence, and studies out there that talk about how millennials care a lot about progression and learning, continuous learning. This is something that it's not just we're saying, oh, it's this nice fancy concept. People really want this, right? And they will be more engaged employees and they will stay longer if you invest the time to train them. I was so frustrated by this problem, I actually started a company and built my own freaking tool. You can use a spreadsheet to track this stuff, but I didn't like how that worked, so I built Takada.io. It is free, I'm not advertising any product for sale here. Just please go use it. If you don't use Takada, use something. Why don't managers spend more time doing this? Why aren't there lots of tools out there to do it? Because most line managers were direct contributors. They bring into their management role what they learned as a direct contributor. So what do they spend their time doing? Fighting fires. They're thinking about production performance problems. They're frustrated by employee relations issues. And they do not have time to think about skill distributions on their teams. It's just not top of mind for them. And we haven't spent enough time with our line managers educating them that they have a different career now and they need to be better at managing their teams. It's just not something we've done a very good job with. So I'm hoping that tools like Takada, I've had conversations with folks at training companies that are starting to think about this. I'm with Jane, I think we're early on in this conversation, but we've got to get better at it, folks. And I'm telling you, if you don't think about team health, it will bite you and it will make your transformation much harder. Remember too that there's kind of two different types of skills you need to be thinking about, and you're going to remediate those things differently. If you can go out to market and hire for something, great. The reality is most of the real issues in your company are probably domain areas. And you need to think about how to remediate those problems. Pair programming and code reviews and documentation, automation, all that stuff helps. So look, at the end of the day, driving DevOps transformations in big companies is really freaking hard and painful. But there's a huge payoff. You can make it a lot easier if you focus on the executives. Don't ignore them. Bring them along for the ride and make them champions of what you're trying to do. Make sure you're thinking about evolving people's behaviors by talking about their values. That's how you're going to make people change their behaviors. And then number 3, give your teams the support they need to stay healthy. Because otherwise, those pain points are going to have a ripple effect and slow everything else down. I appreciate your time.